Ozark Plateau, Missouri. Autumn, 1883. The air carried the first true bite of the coming winter, a clean, sharp promise of hardship that made the settlers of Cedar Creek Township look to their woodpiles and their larders. But Lukas Meier was looking at his foundation. With each trip of his wheelbarrow, he performed an act that baffled and then disgusted his neighbors. He was piling manure, wet, steaming heaps of it from his 2 milk cows and plow horse, directly against the northern and western walls of his family's cabin. Jedediah Croft, a man whose opinions were as frequent as they were loud, leaned against the split-rail fence separating their properties. He watched Lukas for a long time, a look of profound disbelief on his face. Finally, he couldn't contain himself. "Building a wall against the wind, Meier?" he called out, his voice thick with a sarcasm he didn't bother to hide. "Or are you just trying to stink the cold away?" Lukas paused, setting the handles of the heavy wheelbarrow down. He was not a large man, but he moved with a deliberate economy that suggested a deep well of strength. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of a canvas glove and looked at the growing pile. It was already 3 feet high, a dark, pungent rampart against the immaculate fieldstone foundation he'd spent a year setting. He simply nodded toward Jed. "Something like that," he said, his Swiss accent still clinging to the edges of his words. Jed Croft spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Well, that's just foolish," he declared to the world at large. "You'll rot your sills right through. Mark my words. By spring, that cabin of yours will be a stinking, rotten mess, a monument to madness." He shook his head, turned, and walked back toward his own sensible, manure-free home, already crafting the story he would tell at the general store. He didn't see the quiet certainty in Lukas Meier's eyes. Lukas wasn't building a monument to madness. He was building a battery, charged with the lingering energy of the summer sun, and when the killing cold of the Ozark winter arrived, his strange, foul-smelling wall would prove the difference between survival and desperation. If you want to learn the forgotten techniques that kept families warm through the harshest winters, subscribe to our channel. We uncover one piece of frontier ingenuity every week, proving that sometimes the oldest solutions are the most revolutionary. The story of Lukas Meier's folly spread through Cedar Creek Township faster than a brush fire. Jed Croft, a natural storyteller, painted a vivid picture for the men gathered around the pot-bellied stove at the general store. He described the smell, the sheer absurdity of a man intentionally burying his own home in filth. Before long, the Meier homestead had a new name, a mocking nickname that stuck like a burr to a woolen coat: the Stink Bank. Children would sometimes run along the road past his property, holding their noses and chanting the name. Lukas came from a world his neighbors couldn't imagine. He had grown up in the high valleys of Switzerland, where winter wasn't a season, but a siege. His grandfather had managed an Alpine farm, his stone barns housing precious livestock that were the lifeblood of their existence. There, Lukas had learned a secret born of scarcity and observation. His grandfather never wasted anything, least of all, the heat hidden in a pile of dung. He would bank the northern walls of the barns with carefully constructed compost heaps, and through the deepest snows, the internal temperature of those stone structures never dropped to freezing. The animals were healthier, their feed requirements lower. It was a simple biological truth. Lukas was merely translating a principle from animal husbandry to human habitation. He was taking a technique for keeping cattle alive and applying it to keeping his children safe. But in Missouri, this was not wisdom. It was insanity. The criticism soon escalated from casual mockery to serious, well-intentioned concern. Elias Thorne came to visit one crisp October afternoon. Thorne was the most respected builder in the county, a master of the broadaxe and the dovetail joint. He had built more than 30 cabins in the region, including his own, and his work was known to be tight, strong, and honest. He wasn't there to mock. He was genuinely worried. He walked around the cabin, his critical eye taking in the dark, steaming pile. He kicked at the base of it with the toe of his boot. "Lukas," he began, his voice low and serious. "I don't know how they do things where you come from, but this is a mistake. A terrible mistake." He pointed to where the manure met the top of the stone foundation just inches below the massive timber sill. "That moisture, it's going to sit there all winter. It will creep into the wood. By spring, your main sills, the very bones of this house, will be soft with rot. And that's not the worst of it." He gestured to the pile itself. "This is an invitation. You're putting out a warm welcome for every rat, snake, and weasel in a 5-mile radius. They'll burrow in for the warmth and be in your walls before the first snow." Lukas listened patiently, his hands resting on the handles of his shovel. He respected Thorn. He knew the man's reputation. "The stone needs to breathe, Elias," he said, using the local term. "Your fire breathes from inside. My fire will breathe from outside." Thorn just shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "That's poetry, Lukas, not construction. I've built 30 cabins. I know what keeps a home standing, and this ain't it." The next visitor was more official. Mr. Silas Kane, the agent for the railroad company that sold the land plots, stopped by on his quarterly rounds. He was a man who lived by ledgers and manuals, a believer in established procedures. He dismounted from his horse and stared at the compost bank as if it were a personal offense. He took out a small notebook and a pencil. "Mr. Meier," he said, his tone clipped and formal, "this is highly irregular, and frankly, unsanitary. This setup isn't in any manual I've seen. An accumulation of waste like this can breed disease. You have a wife and 2 young children in there to consider." He made a sharp, decisive note in his ledger, the scratching of the pencil sounding like a judgment. The final, and perhaps most painful, criticism came from within the family. Mary's younger brother, Thomas Vance, came for Sunday dinner. He was a good man, but a man who cared deeply about appearances and reputation. He tried to ignore the situation as they ate, but the tension was palpable. After the meal, while Lukas was outside with his son, Samuel, Thomas spoke to his sister. "Mary, what is he doing? People are talking. Jed Croft is calling your home the stink bank. It's embarrassing." He looked around the clean, well-kept interior of the cabin. "It looks like you're living in a barn. It looks like he doesn't trust his own work, that he has to pile dirt and dung against it to keep it standing." The words were meant to be helpful, an expression of familial concern, but they landed like stones. That evening, after Thomas had left and the children were asleep, Mary's composure finally broke. She stood by the hearth, her back to Lukas, her shoulders slumped. "It is hard to be the town story, Lukas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It is hard to hear my own brother pity me. They think you are a fool. They think our home is a sty." Lukas walked over to her. He didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he took her hand and led her to the north wall of the cabin. He pressed her palm against the cold, hard stones of the interior foundation. "Feel this," he said softly. "This stone is a thief. All day, it steals the warmth from our fire and gives it to the cold earth outside. It is a highway for the cold." He paused, letting her feel the deep, penetrating chill of the massive stones. "But soon," he continued, his voice filled with a quiet, unshakable confidence, "that will change. The pile outside is not waste. It is a slow fire. It will warm this stone, and this stone will stop being a thief. It will become a giver. It will give warmth back to us all day and all night. This is not fear, Mary. This is physics." She looked at him, at the certainty in his eyes, and though she didn't fully understand, she chose to trust the man she had followed across an ocean. The community saw a pile of filth. They saw a foolish immigrant ignoring the hard-won wisdom of the frontier. They didn't see the careful, methodical construction of a biological engine. What Lukas Meier was building was not just a pile, it was a system, as precise in its own way as the joinery in Elias Thorne's finest cabinet. It began with a foundation of air. Before the first load of manure was dumped, Lukas laid down a thick 18-inch bed of dry leaves, corn stalks, and straw against the base of the stone foundation. This wasn't just padding, it was a crucial aeration layer. This porous base would allow oxygen to be drawn up into the pile, feeding the microscopic organisms that were the heart of his engine. A smoldering fire needs air to burn, and a compost pile was no different. He was ensuring his fire would breathe. The manure itself was not simply piled high. It was a careful recipe, a mix he had learned from his grandfather. For every 2 parts of green, nitrogen-rich manure, he added 1 part of brown, carbon-rich material, more straw, sawdust from his woodpile, and ash from the hearth. This carbon-to-nitrogen ratio was critical. It was the fuel mix for his biological furnace, calibrated for a long, slow, steady burn, rather than a quick, hot flash. He built the bank outwards and upwards, tamping it down as he went. It was not a vertical wall against the foundation, but a massive sloping berm. At its base, it was 6 feet wide, providing a huge area of contact with the ground and a thick layer of insulation for its own core. It rose 4 feet high, covering the entire 3-foot stone foundation and stopping just shy of the main timber sill, a detail Elias Thorne had missed in his condemnation. A 6-inch air gap, protected by the roof's overhang, separated the compost from the vulnerable wood. Lukas was not a fool. He understood the danger of rot better than anyone. He was heating the stone, not the timber. The final step was the most important. He covered the entire mound with a thick blanket of sod, dug up from a patch of prairie behind his cabin. He laid the sod pieces grass-side down, packing them tightly, and filling the gaps with clay-heavy soil. This outer shell was the insulation for his furnace. It would trap the heat generated within the pile, preventing it from escaping into the winter air, and directing it where he wanted it to go, inward, into the dense thermal mass of the foundation stones. The finished structure looked less like a pile of manure and more like an earthen rampart, a feature of the landscape seamlessly joined to his home. The physics at play were as old as life itself. Inside that dark, insulated mound, a microbial explosion was taking place. Aerobic bacteria, fed by the nitrogen, carbon, and oxygen Lukas had provided, began to reproduce at an astronomical rate. Their metabolic processes, the very act of consuming the organic matter, released energy in the form of heat. The core of a well-built compost pile could reach temperatures of 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't a fire of flame and smoke, but a silent, invisible fire of decomposition. This intense heat radiated outwards from the core. The earthen shell prevented it from escaping into the air. The ground absorbed some of it. But a vast amount of that thermal energy was conducted directly into the 2-foot-thick fieldstone foundation of the cabin. Stone is a poor insulator, but it is a magnificent conductor and a brilliant vessel for thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. Lukas was executing a simple, elegant energy transfer. He was using the 150-degree heat from the compost pile to slowly raise the temperature of tons and tons of foundation stone. This was the reframing insight that no one in Cedar Creek could see. His neighbors looked at the pile and saw waste, a symbol of decay and filth. Lukas looked at it and saw a battery that had been charged all summer, as his cows and horse converted sunshine, grass, and water into chemical energy. Now, he was simply flipping the switch, allowing that stored energy to be released as steady, reliable heat throughout the winter. He wasn't fighting the cold by building bigger fires inside. He was negating it by creating a permanent source of low-grade warmth from the outside. One afternoon, as he patted the last piece of sod into place, his daughter Alara, who was 5, came out to watch him. "Papa, why are you tucking the house into a blanket?" she asked. Lukas smiled and brushed the dirt from his hands. He knelt down to her level. "Because the earth holds summer's memory," he said, tapping the earthen bank. "We just have to ask it to share." Mary watched them from the doorway, seeing the deliberate, almost surgical care with which he had constructed the bank. She finally understood. This was not the act of a madman. It was the work of an engineer, albeit one whose materials were unconventional. She felt a surge of loyalty, a fierce defensiveness of her quiet, methodical husband. That evening, she wrote a letter to her brother Thomas. She did not argue or defend. She simply wrote, "Winter will tell us what's wise and what's foolish." That January, Winter stopped telling stories and started handing out verdicts. A weather system the old-timers called a blue norther descended upon the Ozark Plateau. It wasn't a storm of snow, but a tidal wave of pure, brutal cold. The temperature dropped from a mild 40 degrees to 0 in the space of 3 hours, and it didn't stop. For 6 straight days, the thermometer never rose above -10 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, it bottomed out at -22 degrees Fahrenheit. A relentless, scouring wind out of the northwest made the effective temperature feel closer to 50 below. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a physical presence, an antagonist that tested every nail, every piece of chinking, and every ounce of a family's resolve. The winter had become the judge. The difference wasn't subtle. It was a chasm. Inside Elias Thorne's expertly built cabin, a battle was being fought and lost. Thorne had the largest fireplace in the township and a woodpile that had seemed inexhaustible in October. But the savage cold found its way in. It crept through the floorboards. It radiated from the window panes. Vicious, invisible drafts, caused by the fire's insatiable appetite for oxygen, snaked across the floor, chilling ankles and stealing warmth. The massive fire was a paradox. To generate enough heat to fight the cold seeping through the walls, it had to suck in so much freezing air from outside that it created its own Arctic currents. The Thorne family abandoned all rooms but the main one, huddling together under a mountain of quilts just feet from the roaring blaze. The woodpile vanished at an alarming rate. They burned fence posts. They burned a broken chair. Then came the gut punch detail, the moment of true desperation. Elias stood, stone-faced, and watched his wife, her face streaked with tears, feed the hand-carved maple cradle his own father had built for their firstborn son into the ravenous flames. It was the destruction of a memory to survive a single night. At Jed Croft's place, the situation was grimmer. His cabin was smaller, his wood supply less generous. The wind had found a dozen tiny failures in his chinking and now blasted through with an audible whistle. Every blanket and rug they owned was nailed over the walls, but it did little good. The water barrel, sitting a mere 3 feet from his hearth, was frozen solid. His family was living in a shrinking circle of barely tolerable cold. Stay with me, because the number that came out of the Meier cabin is going to change everything for this community. The simple proof they found on their floorboards defied everything their neighbors thought they knew about winter. And if this story is already changing how you think about heat and survival, take a moment to like this video so more people can discover these lost techniques. Inside the Meier cabin, the world was different. It was quiet. The howling wind was a distant, muffled complaint, not an invading enemy. The air was still free of the drafts that plagued the Thorn house, and it was warm, not the scorching, breathless heat of an overworked stove, but a gentle, pervasive, even warmth. The children, 8-year-old Samuel and 5-year-old Alara, were not huddled by the fire. They were playing on a blanket in the middle of the floor, dressed in their normal woolen shirts, their fingers nimble enough to stack wooden blocks into a teetering tower. The fire in their hearth was small, a calm and friendly presence used for cooking and a bit of cheerful light. It didn't need to roar because it wasn't the primary source of heat. The real work was being done silently, invisibly. The star of the show was a small, unassuming dish on the floor, about a foot from the northern wall. In it was a 1/4 pound of butter. In Jed Croft's house, a stick of butter would have been a block of ice, hard enough to drive a nail. In the Meier cabin, Mary could press her finger into it. It was soft, spreadable. This was the proof device, an undeniable testament to the environment in the room. Lukas led Mary to the foundation wall. "Feel it now," he said. She placed her hand on the stone. It was no longer a thief. The deep, penetrating cold was gone. The stone was not hot, but it was distinctly, miraculously warm. It felt like a sun-warmed rock on a spring day. The tons of stone in the foundation, heated to a steady 50 or 60 degrees by the silent furnace outside, were now a massive radiator, passively releasing warmth into the cabin, day and night. The floorboards near the walls were the warmest in the house. The cold wasn't being driven out, it simply wasn't being invited in. On the 5th day of the freeze, Elias Thorne's woodpile was gone. His family was exhausted, sick from the cold and the smoke. He was a proud man, the best builder in the county, but pride was a poor fuel. He could not admit his failure to the whole town, but he couldn't let his family suffer another night. Swallowing a lifetime of certainty, he pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in a scarf, and walked through the brutal, wind-lashed twilight to the one place he had openly condemned. He walked to Meier's Folly. He knocked on the door, his knuckles aching from the cold. When Lukas opened it, the vindication was immediate and sensory. It wasn't a puff of warm air that escaped. It was a visible cloud, a thick billow of heat and humidity colliding with the minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit air, as dense as steam from a locomotive. The sheer temperature differential was made visible. Thorne stepped across the threshold, and the feeling was a physical shock. He staggered for a moment, his body trying to comprehend the transition from a world of knife-edge cold to one of enveloping, silent warmth. He felt it on his frozen cheeks. He felt it in his lungs. Most of all, he felt it rising up through the soles of his thick leather boots. The floor itself was warm. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene of impossible normalcy. The small, calm fire, the children playing, the air of peaceful tranquility. He saw the thermometer hanging on the far wall, its mercury resting comfortably at 68 degrees, a difference of 90 degrees from the world outside. He looked at Lukas, then at Mary, who met his gaze not with triumph but with simple, quiet dignity. Elias Thorne, the master builder, the man who knew everything about how a cabin should be built, said nothing for a long, heavy moment. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant howl of the wind. He finally took off his frozen hat, his gaze sweeping over the impossible scene one more time. Then, in a low, humbled voice, he spoke the 5 words that changed everything. Silence. "Show me how you built it." The mockery lasted one autumn. The validation would last for generations. Elias Thorne spent the night at the Meier cabin, sleeping more soundly on their floor than he had in his own bed for a week. He asked questions, and Lukas answered them simply, explaining the layers, the materials, the principle of the slow fire. There was no gloating, no, I told you so. There was only the sharing of knowledge. The next morning, Thorne returned to his own frigid home, a profoundly changed man. He didn't post a notice at the general store or make a grand speech. His admission of error was quieter and far more powerful. He took his axe and his shovel and began the back-breaking work of hacking apart his own frozen manure pile. Jed Croft saw him from his window and, mystified, bundled up and went over. "Elias, what in God's name are you doing? Have you gone mad too?" Thorne didn't stop his work. He just grunted. "I'm doing what I should have done in October. I'm building a Meier bank." "But you said it would rot the sills," Croft protested. "You said it was foolish." Thorne finally stopped and leaned on his shovel, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He looked his neighbor square in the eye. "Jed," he said, his voice flat and heavy with the weight of conviction, "I was wrong. I was wrong. Last night his cabin was 68 degrees. His children were playing in their shirt sleeves. His butter was soft." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Go over there. Ask him to let you stand on his floor. Then come back and tell me who the fool is." That was how the idea spread, not through argument, but through the quiet testimony of the most respected builder in the county. People trusted Elias Thorne's judgment on how to build, and when he adopted the very technique he had once condemned, they paid attention. That spring, when the ground thawed, Lukas Meier's stink bank had transformed. The heat of decomposition had broken it down into a pile of rich, black, odorless compost. Mr. Kane, the land agent, arrived on his rounds to see Lukas spreading this wealth onto his vegetable garden. Kane asked about the winter. Lukas didn't boast. He simply stated the facts. "We were warm. We used 1/3 of a cord of wood. My neighbors," he said, with a gesture that held no malice, only fact, "they used 5. Some burned their furniture." Kane stared at the rich soil, then back at the solid stone foundation. He opened his ledger, found the entry about the unsanitary accumulation, and drew a thick, decisive line through it. That autumn, 7 families in Cedar Creek Township built Meier banks against their foundations. The following year, it was nearly 20. The mocking nickname was forgotten, replaced by a term of respect. The technique, adapted with Thorne's construction expertise to better protect the sills and optimize the heat transfer, became a quiet staple of the region for a generation. It wasn't a dramatic revolution. It was a silent adoption of what worked. Lukas Meier had done more than keep his family warm. He had introduced a piece of old-world wisdom that anticipated modern engineering by a century. The principle of using compost as a heat source is now a cornerstone of advanced permaculture and sustainable greenhouse design. He had, in essence, built a passive geothermal heating system, using the most abundant and overlooked resource he had. The story of the stink bank became a quiet lesson in the danger of confusing what is familiar with what is correct. The community had seen a pile of waste because that was all they had ever known it to be. They were trapped by the paradigm of their own experience. Lukas, with knowledge from a different context, saw a storehouse of energy. They saw rot and decay. He saw the vibrant, heat-producing processes of life. They trusted what was traditional. He trusted the unchanging laws of biology and physics. In the end, the coal didn't care about tradition or public opinion. It cared only about thermal dynamics. The frontier did not reward the man with the loudest voice, but the one whose axe and whose thinking was sharpest. If you believe this kind of practical wisdom deserves to be remembered, please subscribe and join our community. Let us know in the comments the coldest winter you've ever had to face. Thank you for spending this time with us. Disclaimer: this story is a fictionalized reconstruction inspired by historical, agricultural, and building practices. The characters and specific events are products of imagination, but the scientific principles of compost heating and thermal mass are real. Always consult with professional engineers and adhere to modern building codes for any construction.